Buongiorno. That's it for my Italian. So thanks very much for coming out for this event today. I want to thank the University del Politecnico di Milano for supporting this event. I want to thank Professor Renato Casagrande, chair of the program, for his support of the program and of this event. And of course, Stefano, not just for organizing this wonderful event and involving me in it, but also for the tremendous work that he has done when it comes to the communication of climate change and climate change risk here in Italy. So thank you very much, Stefano. And of course, thanks to Paola and Marino for giving these two wonderful presentations that help provide some background for what I will be talking about here today. So I'll talk a little bit about the science, and I still do research into climate science. And in the question and answer period after the talk, I would be happy to engage the audience on any aspects of the science of climate change, including those areas that we are working on. But I will mostly be talking about the politics of climate change and climate change denial, particularly with respect to the United States, where we are still battling the forces of denialism. We have a president, as you may know, who has dismissed climate change as a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. So we still have some major challenges in the United States when it comes to even the basic acceptance of the reality of climate change by some of our elected officials. And so we call this the madhouse effect. In English, there's a pun here because there's the greenhouse effect, of course, which is central to the issue of climate change. And so we called the book the madhouse effect, which describes, sort of characterizes how crazy it is in the United States, where we are still dealing with denialism. Of course, it has been translated now to Italian, and I thank Herpley for taking up that effort. La terra brucia. So this is what I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about the sort of our book and the message of that book, and of course in the larger context of our symposium here today, which is about the monumental challenge of climate change after the Paris Agreement. And part of that challenge is getting the major emitters of carbon of the world to commit to doing their part in helping solve this problem. And that's particularly an issue with the United States right now, where we do not have the leadership that we wish we had when it comes to climate change at the highest levels of our government. So first of all, the first part of the discussion here is, science. How does science work? And in order to understand climate change denialism and to put it in a proper context, we need to understand something about how science works. The first cartoon in the book, of course, pays homage to one of the great figures of science who lived, of course, here in Italy, Galileo. Galileo is sometimes considered the patron saint of sort of scientific, the defense of science, and the battle that science sometimes has to do with powerful political or religious forces. And so Galileo is a symbol of the need of scientists and science to fight back against the efforts to attack or suppress scientific findings that might threaten certain vested interests, whether it be the church many centuries ago or today the fossil fuel industry. Of course, the church now is very much on the right side. Pope Francis is a leader on this issue. And the villain here, in a sense, are those fossil fuel interests who continue to try to undermine the public understanding of the science of climate change. Too often, the critics, climate change deniers, attempt to present themselves as Galileo as if they are doing battle with the oppressive forces of science. Well, there's an important quote here attributed to Carl Sagan, was one of the great figures in science in the United States when I was growing up in the 1970s. He had a very popular television show on our public broadcasting network called Cosmos. Carl Sagan was perhaps the greatest science communicator in America in our entire history. And he spoke to this issue of skepticism, and specifically the efforts by those who promote anti-science to sometimes try to dress up as if they are Galileo. As Carl Sagan said, the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus. They laughed at Fulton. They laughed at the Wright brothers, first achieved flight in the United States. But they also laughed at Bozo the Clown, who was another figure from my childhood. He was a very popular clown. And yes, people also laugh at clowns. And so for every true Galileo, for every true revolutionary in science, and there are revolutionaries in science, there are many thousands of Bozo the Clowns who pretend to be modern-day Galileos. And it's dangerous when we afford them, when we allow them to try to wear the mantle of skepticism, because skepticism is a very important and good thing in science, and all good scientists are skeptics. But the rejection of overwhelming scientific evidence based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny, that's not skepticism, that's denialism. Too often in our media, and I think this is certainly less true now in the United States than it once was, and it's even less true here in Italy, where my understanding is that outright denial of the science really isn't treated very seriously in the mainstream media. Although there is a softer form of denialism, which is to say that you accept the science, but then to reject the threat and the risks or the need to actually do something about it. I think that is still prevalent here and throughout the world. So too often in our media, though, there is this tendency to treat climate change denialism as if it is an equally valid position to the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists, as if the truth somehow lies in between the science and the contrarians. And this cartoon by Tom Tolles, my co-author, is sort of demonstrating how dangerous it is when we frame this problem in terms of false balance, when we treat climate change deniers as if they deserve an equal seat at the table with the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists. And there is, and even in some of our leading media outlets like the New York Times still tends to entertain contrarians in the climate change debate and often gives them a prominent forum for their message, often their message that takes the form of that softer form of denial, not outright denial of the physical science, denial of the greenhouse effect, but denial that it's really a problem or that we need to do something, change our way of doing things. So the basics. There is overwhelming evidence. The world's scientists have reached a consensus that climate change is real, it's human-caused, and it already represents a threat. Some people will point to uncertainty as if it's a reason for inaction. Oh, well, there's still some uncertainty in the science. Well, let me say there's still some uncertainty in the science of gravity, because we still have not observed the fundamental particle of gravity, the graviton. So you might call me a gravity skeptic. There's still some important uncertainties in the theory of gravity. That doesn't make it safe to jump off a cliff. And yet there are those who would have us jump off the metaphorical cliff of climate inaction based on similar levels of uncertainty. the great Stephen Hawking, who sadly passed away recently. Stephen Hawking did not suffer fools, and he did not suffer climate change deniers. And he had a very strong message for them. He said, next time you meet a climate change denier, tell them to take a trip to Venus, and Stephen Hawking will pay the fare. He'll pay for the ticket. And of course, Venus is an example of a runaway greenhouse effect, and we wouldn't be able to explain the climate of Venus, or why Mars is as cold as it is, or the climates of any of the planets if it were not for the fundamental science of the greenhouse effect. The linkage between climate change and extreme weather, this is a particular, we have a term, a pet peeve. It's something that continues to bother me, the way we often deal with this linkage in our public discourse. Too often, the linkage will be dismissed with the claim that, well, you can't blame any one weather event on climate change. Well, you know, that may be true, because that weather event may very well have occurred whether or not climate change, itself existed. But there are attributes of those extreme weather events, that they're hotter than they used to be, that there's more rainfall than there used to be, that there are more persistent droughts than there used to be. Many of these events are indeed being made more extreme by climate change, and there is a direct linkage there. And it's a linkage that we need to talk about because this is really, and we heard some nice discussion here earlier this morning about the way that climate change is impacting extreme weather events here in Italy. This is something that really matters. This is something that the public cares about. This is something that affects us directly. And for scientists not to talk about that linkage simply because they're afraid that they will be attacked by climate change deniers for drawing a causal linkage, that would be unfortunate, because we do need to connect the dots for the public. These events are being made worse by climate change. An example, last year we had, by some measure, the worst hurricane season on record. Hurricane Harvey was the wettest event on record in the United States. And yes, Hurricane Harvey might have happened with or without climate change, but the fact that it was feeding off of record warm ocean temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico means there was more moisture in the atmosphere. Just last week, there was an article in the journal Nature that demonstrated something that we have argued as well in our own research, that these storms may actually be slowing down in how quickly they move because of the way that climate change is changing the prevailing wind patterns. And what made Harvey so devastating was those very warm ocean temperatures, which means lots of moisture in the atmosphere. The more moisture in the atmosphere, the more rainfall you can produce. And if that storm basically stays in place, it doesn't move, it sits over the same location day after day, that's when you get unprecedented flooding like Houston got. And then there were these record storms. Irma was the strongest storm ever, the strongest hurricane ever in the open Atlantic. There was one storm in the Gulf that was once that was stronger, but in the open part of the Atlantic, the strongest storm ever. Over the last three, and the critics would say, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. Well, we know that warmer ocean temperatures provide more energy to strengthen these storms. We know that ocean surface temperatures have been the warmest on record over the past several years, and during that period, we've seen the strongest hurricane ever. That was Hurricane Patricia in the North Pacific, which was also the strongest storm in the Northern Hemisphere and the Pacific. We saw the strongest storm ever in the Southern Hemisphere, that was Winston, that made landfall in Fiji. And we saw the strongest storm, obviously, in the Pacific, but also in the open Atlantic with Irma. So maybe that's just a coincidence. I don't think so. I think we are clearly seeing the impact of climate change in these more extreme weather events, these more extreme hurricanes. And of course, Maria, which followed Irma, wasn't quite as strong, but it made landfall as a Category 5 hurricane on Puerto Rico. And Americans forget that the people of Puerto Rico are American citizens. That was the biggest natural disaster ever to impact American citizens. And Puerto Rico is still recovering. More than, nearly a year later, many people still don't have fresh drinking water. They still don't have electricity. This is the United States of America. So this idea that we can't link climate change to extreme weather events because we can't prove that that event was literally caused by climate change, as Tom notes in the small print here. And when you read his cartoons, you always have to look down in the corner because there's this little guy you see at the artist's desk. That's Tom himself, his self-portrait. And there's always an important message that adds to the cartoon. This idea that we can't draw this linkage is a loophole. It's a way of avoiding responsibility. We call that a loophole. A loophole you could lose a planet through, a pretty big loophole. So why should we care? It's not just about penguins and polar bears. I do care about penguins and polar bears. I do care about the idea that we could leave behind a world that lacks the beauty and wonder for our children that we grew up with. To me, as a parent, that matters. But it's about much more than just penguins and polar bears. It's about unprecedented droughts. California has had the worst drought on record. And when I say on record, it's as far back as the tree ring scientists can go, at least 1,200 years. The worst drought in at least 1,200 years, maybe longer. That's probably not a coincidence. In fact, we can point to how climate change indeed has increased drought. Warmer soil temperatures, more loss of moisture through evaporation, less snow in the winter in the mountains, less runoff of fresh water in the spring, and a jet stream that continues to push those storms north of where they would normally go, denying California the winter rainfall that it normally gets. There's a linkage there as well. Increasingly, there's evidence that climate change is probably impacting the jet stream in a way that pushes those storms to the north, away from California. So it's a problem for agriculture, but these droughts are a problem for national security. The unprecedented drought in Syria has actually created the conditions that allowed conflict, that increased conflict in the cities of Syria, and that created an environment where terrorist organizations like ISIS are able to form. And the national security community sees that linkage. They understand that climate change is what they call a threat multiplier. It doesn't literally cause these conflicts. It exacerbates them. It takes existing conflicts over water, over land, over food, and it exacerbates them because of the scarcity of resources that it's causing. And our national security community recognizes that this is the greatest threat to national security. Now, fortunately, this is not an issue here in Italy, where there's really no evidence that conflict is creating political tensions here in Italy. Well, maybe there is. African migrants are environmental refugees. These are people who are fleeing Africa because of the impacts of climate change and the scarcity of food and water that is causing. And if you read the headlines just over the last week or so, then you might think that actually this is a problem. This isn't a far-off, distant problem for Italy. This is a problem that Italy is dealing with now. Now, this problem is on the front pages of Italian newspapers, the conflict over and the fact that these African migrants were turned away. And there's now a debate with France over whose responsibility it is to take in these migrants. That sounds a lot like the sort of warnings we had from the national security community years ago when they said that environmental refugeeism is going to lead to increased conflict, including conflict between industrial nations like France and Italy. So this matter is on the front pages of the newspapers of Italy. What's not on the front pages, unfortunately, is the very direct relationship that this has with climate change. We need to connect the dots. People need to understand that these conflicts, terrorism, and conflicts over migrants and immigration are very directly linked to the challenges that are being created by climate change. And that's important because when you ask people how concerned are they about climate change in the United States, it's usually number 5, maybe number 6 on their list of concerns. You ask them, what are your concerns about international terrorism? It's usually close to the top, number 1. Or immigration, number 1. Well, there's a direct linkage. And so that concern really is a concern about climate change, and they need to understand that it is. Because the solution then to that problem is acting on the underlying problem, which is climate change. But we still face denial. You saw the CO2 graph earlier. This is, and then similar temperature graphs that show how temperatures are increasing. You often hear this claim made in the United States that there's been a pause in global warming, that global warming has stopped. Do you ever hear that here? Yes? Okay, you hear that? Well, let's look at the data. 2016 was the warmest year on record for the globe. Well, actually, 2014 was the warmest year on record for the globe until 2015, which became the warmest year on record for the globe, until 2016, which became the warmest year on record for the globe on the whole. The good news is that 2017 was not the warmest year on record. It was only the second warmest year on record. Well, 3 consecutive record-breaking years. Maybe it could happen by chance alone. Maybe it's natural variability. Stovetop temperatures change all the time, these frogs are saying to each other. Nothing to worry about. It's just a natural fluctuation in temperature. Well, we actually wrote an article a year ago estimating the likelihood of getting 3 consecutive record-breaking years, 2014, 2015, 2016, in the absence of human-caused climate change. And it turns out that likelihood is very low, and we described it in this article, but I think the best summary of our findings was this summary in Discover magazine, which summarized our key conclusion here. The record global warming streak of 2014 through 2016, and this is an American expression, but maybe it translates here, a snowball's chance in hell that this was natural. It wasn't natural. We can't explain it from natural variability. We are seeing the impact of climate change. The impacts are no longer subtle. We are seeing them play out in real time. We have senators like James Inhofe, who believe that coming out onto the floor of the U.S. Senate with a snowball in the winter disproves global warming. That is sort of the state of discourse on the science of climate change within the U.S. Senate. It's a sad commentary. Just a few weeks ago, we had a congressman, you may have heard about this, who said that climate change is caused by the rocks falling into the ocean. And maybe you would think that that's a one-off. That was just a chance, unlikely occurrence. But just a week later, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, one of our leading newspapers. Of course, its editorial pages are controlled by ultra-conservative, their ultra-conservative editorial board, who also deny that climate change is real. And the article, the title of the op-ed was "The Sea is Rising, but Not Because of Climate Change." Sea level rise, nothing to do with climate change. You don't have to worry. It's those rocks falling into the ocean. We likened that to saying objects are falling, but it's not due to gravity. Or the continents are moving, but it's not due to plate tectonics. It's about as sensible as either of those two statements. And we wrote a letter of response, a letter to the editor pointing out how absurd that op-ed was and what the science actually has to say. And I know that at least one person read this letter to the editor because they were sitting next to me on a flight that day. They opened up their paper and they were reading our letter to the editor. I said, "That's our letter. That's our letter." Well, so sea level rise. So, the argument is, well, maybe the next, climate change is real. Well, maybe it's real, and maybe it's human-caused, at least in part. But hey, it's self-correcting. The problem will just solve itself. And here the cartoon sort of suggests that if you mean that the sea levels will get so high that they snuff out all of the coal-fired power plants, well, if that's what you mean by self-correcting, then I suppose it is. Or it's a good thing. Okay, it'll be good for us. Now, certainly, no politician in the United States would be so absurd to actually claim that climate change would be good for us. I mean, certainly certainly not the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who's tasked with dealing with the problem of climate change, would say that climate change is a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, may help humans flourish, actually is good. There it is. Global warming may be a good thing. Yes, Scott Pruitt finally said exactly what's written down here. This, again, is the state of discourse when it comes to the politics of climate change today in the United States. Well, if you mean by a good thing unprecedented droughts and floods and heat waves and superstorms, because that's what we're seeing, and wildfires, unprecedented wildfires, if that's what you mean by a good thing, then I suppose climate change is a good thing. But the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We are seeing the damaging impacts of climate change now in terms of extreme weather events that are being made worse by climate change. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone who's interested about some of the science that we've actually done looking at those linkages, because those linkages are very real. And the scientific linkages are very real, and the images on our television screens are very real, and they are linked. And it isn't just the United States, of course, Europe, and we've already heard something about that. Again, unprecedented storms, floods, heat waves, droughts. Here in Italy, the impacts of climate change are being felt everywhere. And then finally, of course, the argument goes, all right, well, maybe it's human caused, maybe it's caused, it's real, it's caused by human activity, and maybe it is a problem, but it's too late to do anything about it. Well, fortunately, that isn't true either. It is not too late to act on this problem, but there is great urgency, and we have done actually some science looking at that. We had a nice discussion the other day when we celebrated the 10th anniversary of Stefano's climate site, Climateranti. We had an interesting discussion about stabilizing warming below dangerous levels, and some nations say that many of the Western nations of the world have sort of accepted 2 degrees Celsius warming of the planet relative to the pre-industrial as constituting dangerous and irreversible climate change. But if you're an island nation in the Pacific, Tuvalu, that is now already facing inundation and saltwater intrusion. If you're Miami Beach, which is now regularly being flooded just by high tides because of sea level rise. If you're Texas or Oklahoma, that saw the worst drought on record, they lost 25% of their cattle in Texas in the 2011 Oklahoma drought. For many regions around the world, a dangerous climate change has already arrived. By some measures, dangerous climate change is here, and it's a matter of just how dangerous are we willing to allow it to get. And what we showed was that 1.5 limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius may now nearly be impossible without what are known as negative emissions, without actually actively sucking some of the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And there was some discussion about, some of the technologies that may exist for doing that, and we would have to turn to those technologies if we want to limit warming to 1.5. 2 degrees Celsius, we can still limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius in all likelihood if we bring our emissions down rapidly enough. And so it's simply, the limitation there isn't physical. It is possible to do this. The only real limitation is willpower, having the willpower to do what's necessary, and making sure that we hold our policymakers accountable and electing politicians who are willing to act on this problem. Not just say the right words about the problem, but actually put those words into action, acting on the problem. And there is this ongoing war on climate science, which is very much felt in the United States. And as Stefano alluded to earlier, I have found myself in the center of the attacks against climate change because of the iconic nature of the hockey stick curve that my co-authors and I published 20 years ago on Earth Day, which is April 22nd in the United States. So just a couple months ago, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the original 1998 hockey stick article, which was published on Earth Day, April 22nd, 1998. And 20 years later, I continue to be attacked by climate change denying politicians who understand that this, if they could just bring down this iconic graph, if they could just discredit this iconic graph, they somehow think that will discredit the entire science of human-caused climate change, as if it rests on a single graph published by a single scientist 20 years ago, when in fact our understanding of human-caused climate change is based on many independent lines of evidence produced by thousands of scientists around the world over many decades. But there is still this war on climate science. And sometimes the hypocrisy of our politicians is pretty remarkable, and I'll just tell this one story. Ken Cuccinelli, nice Italian name, he was the former Attorney General of the state of Virginia, and I was a faculty member at the University of Virginia, which was a university. Our universities aren't as old as the European universities, but this one is special. It was founded by Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. It's one of our great universities. It's a pearl within the university system in the United States. And back when I was a member of the faculty at the University of Virginia, before we took up positions at Penn State University, so Ken Cuccinelli, actually it was after we had left the university. It was in 2009 when he was elected Attorney General, but he tried to use a legal tactic, a subpoena, to force the University of Virginia to turn over all of my personal emails from when I was at the University of Virginia, so that he could look through them and try to find some word or phrase that he could use to discredit us, to try to discredit the hockey stick. And this is a favorite tactic these days. We saw this, of course, play out in our last presidential election. Steal some emails, go through them, and look for a word that you can use to try to make somebody look bad. This is a common political tactic, and it was deployed against us. He was unsuccessful. The Washington Post, one of our leading newspapers, wrote 5 editorials blasting Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt. They called it a witch hunt. And their award-winning cartoonist, the Washington Post's editorial cartoonist, Tom Towles, at the time, before I knew him, before I wrote a book with him, published 2 articles, two cartoons blasting, criticizing Ken Cuccinelli's attack against me in the University of Virginia. And I have to say, this is my favorite of the 2. There's Ken Cuccinelli up in the judge's chair, and poor Galileo down below. He wants his emails too. Apparently, if he could just get a hold of Galileo's emails, he's sure he could discredit Galileo's work. And so that, again, sort of speaks to the nature of our political discourse when it comes to climate change. Well, Ken Cuccinelli's civil subpoena was quashed by the court, the lower court, on a technicality. In his 40-page long filing to the court, he had failed to provide any evidence of wrongdoing on my part. And so the case was thrown out. He appealed to the state Supreme Court, which ruled against his subpoena with prejudice, which means the court was saying to the Attorney General, we don't ever want you to come back to the court system with something like this again. So it was a very strong statement by our courts, which are sort of some see as the last sort of the last option when it comes to politically motivated sort of assaults on our politics. The courts are often the last refuge where we can hopefully rely upon wise people to make good decisions. So they ruled against him with prejudice. They said, Ken Cuccinelli, we don't ever want to see you or any other attorney general come to the court with something like this again. It's inappropriate. He ran to be governor of Virginia in the next election. As you can see here, I campaigned with his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, actively. I spent a week on the campaign trail supporting the campaign of Terry McAuliffe. At the final campaign rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, I introduced Bill Clinton, who then introduced Terry McAuliffe at this rally. McAuliffe was successful. He became governor of Virginia. Ken Cuccinelli lost that race, and he went on to manage an oyster farm on an island, Tangier Island. It's an island in the Chesapeake Bay that is slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. So you can't make this stuff up, folks. You just can't make it up. When it comes to climate change denial, yes, hypocrisy, climate change denial is thy name. Well, if we can get past this bad faith debate that we continue to have in our political system in the United States about whether climate change is real, and on to the worthy debate about what to do about it. And there's some who say, and it sort of relates to this softer form of denial that I talked about, well, okay, maybe it's real and maybe it's a problem, but we can continue to burn fossil fuels and build up CO2 in the atmosphere. We'll just do something else. We'll do something else to the planet to try to offset the effects of global warming. There's a cartoon from our, it's the Frankenstein monster actually, there's an interesting story when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. She was vacationing in Lake Constance, just to the north of here, not too far to the north of here. It was the summer of 1815, I believe. It was a very cold summer in Europe. It was a very damp and dreary summer because of the effects of a volcanic eruption that cooled the climate, that cooled the globe for a couple of years. And so she stayed indoors that summer, and she wrote Frankenstein. So there's a climate story there, actually. So whether it's shooting particles into the stratosphere to try to block out some of the sunlight, dumping iron into the ocean to try to fertilize the algae and get them to suck more CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's a huge array of these so-called geoengineering schemes, and in many cases, the cure could be worse than the cause. It is possible that we could end up worse off than if we hadn't engaged in these unprecedented, uncontrolled, dangerous activities. They are, in English, we call this the principle of unintended consequences. Beware of some solution when you don't know all the implications of that solution. And that is very true in the case of geoengineering. We could certainly potentially make things even worse. So probably that is not the approach to fighting climate change. Although our former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who happened to be the former CEO of the world's largest fossil fuel company, ExxonMobil, maybe it's a coincidence that Rex Tillerson, when he was Secretary of State under Trump, viewed climate change as an engineering problem. We'll continue to burn all those fossil fuels. My former company, that still probably pays me, ExxonMobil, will continue to make record profits as we continue to burn all those fossil fuels. But we'll shoot stuff into the atmosphere, we'll dump things into the ocean, and maybe we'll get lucky, and it will magically offset the effects of global warming. So there are serious discussions within the policy arena in the United States about geoengineering. Again, probably that is not the approach. That's probably not a safe way of solving this problem, which leaves the larger challenge. The only real solution, the only real path forward is to stem this problem at its source. And as I alluded to, Pope Francis, a very important development in the larger conversation about climate change is that Pope Francis, who represents more than 1 million Catholics around the world and many millions of other people who look to him for guidance and inspiration. I think he has a very large following around the world among Catholics and non-Catholics alike. And he sort of speaks with great moral authority, and when he lent his voice to a call for action on climate change through his encyclical a few years ago, I think that helped change the conversation. It helped recenter the conversation where I think it needs to be, because too often we frame the issue of climate change purely as a matter of science or policy or politics, economics, the economics of climate change mitigation. But what it really is, more than anything else, in my view, is ethics. It's about ethics. It's about the ethics of leaving behind a world for our children and grandchildren that is worse than the world we inherited. I think there is a deep ethical lapse in our refusal to act on this problem. And so he's helped recenter the conversation. And then we had this historic agreement in Paris, the Paris Agreement. Every country of the world, including Italy, including the U.S., although, as you know, Donald Trump has threatened to pull out of Paris, the one, that would make us the only country in the world. Well, it turns out it doesn't even really matter whether Trump pulls out of Paris or not, because there's enough action taking place at the local level, at the state level, by our largest companies in the United States, that the United States will, in all likelihood, make good on its commitment to the Paris Accord, with or without Donald Trump. We will still meet our obligations. Here's the problem. Paris gets us on the right road, but it doesn't solve the problem. It cuts our emissions by about half what we need to cut them by if we are to avoid that sort of dangerous 2 degrees Celsius warming. So Paris gets us on the right path, it gets us on the right road, but we have to continue to build. There's more work that needs to be done. We all have to ratchet up our commitments if we are going to stabilize warming below dangerous levels. And we've run into this wall. It's not the wall that Donald Trump threatened to build to keep out the people of Mexico, some of whom indeed are fleeing, are environmental refugees, are fleeing the impacts that climate change is having. So I'm not talking about that wall, that physical wall that he threatened to build between Mexico and the United States. I'm talking about the wall that he built between the facts of climate change and himself. And he always liked to say, we will build this wall and the Mexicans will pay for it. Well, in fact, this wall that he's building, we will all pay for it. We will all suffer the consequences if the United States doesn't own up to its responsibility, its obligations. As I said, Paris gets us halfway there. We need to build on Paris. Now is not the time to, the time for inaction, the sort of inaction that is favored by Trump and his cabinet. So we all know that Trump has rejected climate change, that he's rejected the science as a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. He's threatened to undo a lot of the important policy progress that was made under the Obama administration, the Clean Power Plan to get us off of coal, the effort to require greater fuel efficiency by automobiles. Trump and his administration are trying to undo that, and of course he's threatened to pull out of the Paris Accord as well. And it isn't just Trump, it's the people that he's appointed to key offices within his administration. Down in the left corner, the right corner here is Scott Pruitt, who I mentioned earlier, the EPA administrator, who is a climate change denier, and is trying to undo all of the environmental progress made by the United States over the last 50 years. As EPA administrator, he is literally trying to dismantle environmental protections that were put in place by Republicans. Republicans like Richard Nixon, George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, who signed the Montreal Protocol to ban chlorofluorocarbons. Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. He passed the Clean Air Acts, the Clean Water Acts. There was all this progress that was actually made under, it wasn't always the case that the Republican Party was the party of anti-science and anti-environmentalism. It's only in recent years that that's become true, and it's never been more true than under Donald Trump. And the people that he's appointed, like Scott Pruitt, were hand-selected by plutocrats, billionaires like the Koch brothers who are behind, who fund a lot of the attacks on climate change in the United States. They hand-selected many of the cabinet members. We say that Trump picked them, but that's not really true. It was the Koch brothers who picked them. The Vice President, Mike Pence, was picked by the Koch brothers. These are among the wealthiest individuals in the world who have used their wealth and power to try to in essence, advance a public relations campaign to promote deregulation and to deny the environmental threat of climate change. And of course, then in Congress, we have the head of both the Senate and the House of Representatives who have aided the Trump administration in their agenda of climate change denialism and their agenda of inaction on climate change. So we have no leadership either at the presidential level or within the legislative branch, our Congress, which is currently controlled by Republicans who deny climate change as well. Lamar Smith is the chair of the House of Representatives Committee on Science. I testified at his committee a year ago where I pointed out that how inappropriate it is for the chair of the Science Committee to be promoting anti-science, the same sort of anti-science that Galileo was dealing with many centuries ago is being promoted by the chair of the House of Representatives Science Committee, arguably the highest official within our government focused on the promotion of science. And I read a quote that he didn't like. It was a quote in Science Magazine, which is perhaps our most prestigious magazine about science in the United States. And the quote said that Lamar Smith was using his chairmanship not to advance the cause of science, but to advance his own ideological agenda. And I read that quote that had just been published in Science, and he said, "That's a biased source. That's an unreliable source. That's fake news." He didn't say fake news, but I said, "Well, that's Science Magazine. It's the greatest authority on science in our entire media." Again, that's the state of discourse in the United States today. And so what can we do? As scientists, we can speak out. And I've written editorials in the New York Times making the argument that as scientists, and not all scientists, but some of us need to be willing to speak out. We need to be out there defending science against the constant attacks. And I've done that in every way that I can. We had our first ever science march in Washington, D.C. a little over a year ago. And I was up at the front of that march with this friend of mine. You may recognize him. Anyone here know who Bill Nye? Bill Nye, the science guy. He's a popular science figure. Children grow up learning about science from him. And he was out in front as well, out there defending science against these unprecedented attacks. And we need to do that in every way that we can. Lastly, let me finally say, and we had a nice discussion about this the other night down in Lodi about, there's the denial of climate change, but there's another threat here. Another argument that increasingly we hear, that it's too late, there's nothing we can do about it, the problem's too big, and it's just, we might as well give up. We just can't solve this problem. It's too overwhelming. To me, that line of argumentation is every bit as dangerous as outright denial of the physical science, because it leads us down the same road. It leads us down the same road of inaction. And the fact is that we can still prevent the worst impacts of climate change from occurring, but it requires concerted action. And simply declaring doom and gloom and defeat leads us in exactly the opposite direction of the direction we need to move in. And so we need to confront the doom and gloom when we encounter it, because it's every bit as dangerous as the anti-science, as the outright denial of climate change, in my view. And finally, why does it matter? It's not an exaggeration to say that the planet literally does lie in the balance. Our decisions today are going to determine what sort of world we leave behind for our children and grandchildren. And so we need to do everything we can in the United States and here in Italy to make sure that we don't do that, that we do preserve the planet for future generations. As Pope Francis has said, you can see it as an issue of stewardship to the earth, our obligation under the Bible, or as a parent or a grandparent who wants a better world for their children and grandchildren. And I'll leave it on that. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.